or even cultural activities. These are all incorporated now into that broad term of economic development. Colleen, what is this one that's here?
Well, that's up in Salmon Arm, but I just kind of wanted to piggyback on what you were just saying there, Dale. You know, when you and I first started in economic development, and that was about 25 years or so ago, we didn't talk about any of those things that you had just mentioned. You know, we didn't talk about housing. We didn't talk about healthcare particularly. There were other organizations that looked after that. And that is just not the case today, as you were saying, Dale. Workforce development is a key component of what you need to do in economic development. And again, that's a fairly recent, maybe, you know, over the last 5 years, it's been a really strong component of economic development that used to be left up to those organizations who specialized in workforce development. You know, it's only been the last couple of years that economic development has really started to get involved with affordable housing. And what does that mean for the community? Because they do all overlap. If you don't have all of these things in your community, a strong workforce, affordable housing, healthcare that's there, as you said, the recreation, the educational, economic development can't function without any of those things that traditionally were thought of community development before, but it is all one and the same.
Yeah, that's really a comment, Colleen, because one of the, like you'd mentioned about other organizations, and I don't think we're all thinking that an economic developer needs to do everything, but the economic developer and your economic development program needs to be integrated into these other organizations or other things that are out there. You know, can it support? Is there a way to? One of the things that economic developers always have to do is when somebody's looking at your community to invest, or when even a business that's in your community, they need to know that the person they're talking to about their business is connected to those other organizations that might impact their business. So it's you know, it's an important thing to link all of those things together rather than working in our own silos, in our own little groups and ignoring the rest. So, and this particular center in from Splatsen is it's a mixture of a cultural facility, but it's also got a community kitchen in it, and it's got other things that are sort of economic development and community development all combined into one type of building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and community kitchens, just to add on to that, it's something, again, we never thought of as economic development, and food security is becoming a really crucial, important part for economic development to get into for their communities.
Yeah, food security is really important in so many communities, as well as, you know, with the community kitchens can definitely help with that for sure. The economic development staff, and one of the things that we really notice a lot in our career, but even with running the BC Economic Development Association, we see this a lot, and that is that disconnect between your economic development staff, whether the economic development staff is actually just a staff member and their title is economic development officer or manager of economic development, but then you also have community development corporations, and so no matter how the makeup is, it's important as a community, as a chief and council and other administration, whether it's the land planning division or, you know, whatever division it is, administration, are all aware of what the economic development staff does. And that burden isn't only put on the chief and council or the other administration or other departments. It's also the economic developer's responsibility to make sure that they're playing a really important role of educating their leaders as to what it is that they're doing, but also the rest of the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, this could read two ways. I like how we have it, you know, understand what your economic development staff does. And that does speak to that local leader, those stakeholders, those other people within your community. But if we would just have an audience of only economic development practitioners, the slide should probably read, communicate what you do as economic development staff. And that onus is on you to do that. For sure. If you don't have the support of your local leaders, of the stakeholders in your community, you know, it's going to be a real struggle to have successful economic development. It really is. And there's some really simple ways that you can communicate what it is that you do. And it doesn't have to be, I think a lot of times, particularly those new to economic development, think they have to have this huge win. And we'll talk about that later too, but this huge win in their community before they can start talking to their community about what it is they do, right? And it's just the small little things that you do as economic development practitioners every single day. It's that networking, it's those partnerships that you build, it's that meeting with a potential entrepreneur, it's the mentoring of youth in your community. It's all of these things that you may not think are huge or important, but they really are. And your community needs to understand that's what really builds a strong economic development program is the smaller things.
It's so, and you know, the first two slides that we've talked about here, and then when you look at the people that have logged into this session, Colleen, and there's, you know, we've got representatives from Quebec and from Manitoba, and here in British Columbia with Squamish and Terrace, and the number of Indigenous communities across the country that are actually on this call. It's the same, whether it's in British Columbia or whether it's in Quebec or Atlantic Canada or Manitoba or Saskatchewan or Alberta, wherever, it's the same. We need to communicate, and we don't communicate well with really what it is, the important role that economic development is playing in our community. You need to have an economic development strategy in place, and we see this so often, and I'm not going to name people or do anything like that, but what I'm going to say is when you're doing economic development strategies, there's so many different aspects that you need to look at, you know, from a really good SWOT analysis, from from identifying the goals and objectives that you as a community, that your community wants to do, that your nation, or however you're doing, if you're doing it as a whole region, if you're doing it as individual communities, and even in the sense of if you're doing it as a nation and there's multiple communities, to make sure that you're identifying those specific things for the individual communities as well as for the nation, because they're all combined. And you need to look at, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but what is the region doing as a whole? What are the local governments doing? What are the regional governments doing? What is the provincial government doing to make sure that you're taking advantage of the other assets that are out there? Like I say, we're going to talk a lot more about that, but your plan needs to be comprehensive, but it doesn't need to be ridiculously large. And it also needs to clearly identify who's going to do what, because not the economic development officer can't do everything. There can be community members, there can be chief and council, there can be the administration, there can be the land planning department. Who's going to do what to help implement the specific actions that you're doing?
Yeah. And you know what, I would say too, a lot of times when we look at economic development strategies, some of the ones that we've seen over the years have been very comprehensive. And I'm going to say that in a negative way, in some ways, it's too much. We've seen communities that have, maybe 500 in their community and maybe 3,000 in an entire region. And their strategy is, 150 pages long and identifies, 267 strategies. So, and there's never an economic development staff there. So these are the type of things that I think really can give a distaste for an economic development strategy in a way. Like it really disappoints me when I see that communities either spend way too much for a strategy or they get something back that is completely not doable. So if I had to say what your economic development strategy should be, there's just two words that come to mind for me: realistic and doable. And being realistic and doable really depends on what it is in your community right now. What are your priorities? You don't have to have, 117 priorities, because you're never going to get to them, for one thing. Maybe your strategy is really focusing on only 3 or 4 things, and that's okay, because you can do those things really well before you move to maybe another set, right? So realistic and doable also means making sure your strategy is developed with what your resources are, and that means your staff. So do you even have an economic development individual full-time and dedicated to doing economic development and implementing that strategy? And what type of money do you have? There's a lot of things you can do in economic development that don't cost a lot of things, but there are some project money that you do need. So really look whether you do it in-house, whether you hire somebody to do your strategy, either way, that's what you really, I think, need to focus on. Realistic, doable, based on your resources.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we used to say before. Sometimes economic development strategies become, they should be a floating document. So things changed. COVID is a perfect example of that. I think in December of last year, all of us were thinking about Christmas and getting through. We're so excited about 2020. Well, and then things happened, and we had our plans, and we had our goals, and we had our budgets, and we had everything in place that we were going to do in 2020. And look what happens. And you need to adapt. You need to change. And sometimes strategies are not written in such a way that it can be flexible, but you need to remember that they are. And something that you may have planned to do 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 3 years from now, maybe it needs to be done now. And so your plan needs to change. And one of the things that Colleen and I like to do when we develop strategies is to lay things out. So this is a priority. This is year 1, year 2, year 3, but we always preface it with, this is ideal. It may not happen. You need to be flexible in what happens. And Colleen, you're so right about how long these plans can get. And I think one of the, we have done, a communities of, 350 people. We've done communities, larger communities. And the thing is the same, is to make them realistic. Paper isn't everything. Pages aren't everything. It's the content that's really important. And I kind of chuckle when I think of a smaller community that goes, oh, we got to have, there needs to be more in the strategy. And yet, like we're working on with a community right now of over 100,000 people or 200,000 people, whatever it is. I guess I should look. They want like 12 pages. They don't want ridiculous enough. They just want to clearly know what it is they should be doing. And let's skip the rest of this stuff that nobody reads. Nobody reads that 150, the first 50 pages of a strategy sometimes can be just text and talk for the purpose of talking. Let's just get to the point as to what we need to do. Be realistic about your readiness. And we see this all the time. It doesn't matter, again, where you're located. What matters is whether if you're going to do economic development, you need to be ready to do economic development. You need to have your land policies in place. You need to have, how you're going to manage external investors. You need to talk about how are you going to work with entrepreneurs to help them make it easier for them to be in business. And in some cases, communities are just not ready. And it's so important to get that type of infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't always have to mean, we've got pipes running everywhere as far as water, sewers, and everything else. I mean, some situations every community is different. There's other aspects of whether you're ready. Do you have a community profile? Do you communicate regionally? Do you understand the importance of the existing businesses that are on your community, and are you working with them? All of these types of things are all parts of that. Now, we have an assessment test that we give to communities to do, and then it's a self-assessment. So you don't have to, again, Colleen, you said so well about how much money you have to spend. You don't have to spend money all the time, because there are like tools out there, like a self-assessment tool to assess your readiness. Yes, there's some communities that decide they want to pay to do a much broader investment readiness assessment with clear recommendations on how they become investment ready, but there's also that self-assessment. And then hopefully you can start knocking off some of those areas where you failed. Now, I do want to caution you, and Colleen and I have done, a lot of these over the years. Very few communities will ever pass it, a self-assessment on their level of investment readiness the first time around. But what they do is they identify their gaps, and then they can start working towards fixing those.
Yeah, what I like about the assessment, and we're happy to share that assessment along with the presentation after we finish the webinar today. It won't take you long to go through, but it really looks at some of those key components of economic development, as Dale said. So it is looking at your economic development capacity. What does that look like today? Do you have those economic development tools that you need to market your community, to work with existing businesses? What are the, sort of how do you market your community, not only internally, but externally? The land use planning and the policies and all of that is included in the assessment. And as Dale said, it's really good, regardless of whether you pass or fail, it does identify those gaps. And then going back to the last slide about developing a strategy, using that assessment tool can really actually do at least a first-year strategy for you. You may find these gaps that you're like, okay, well, we don't have the tools that we need. Let's make that a priority for this year to develop those tools. There's a strategy right there. That's something you can focus on. And again, you can do it all in-house. It doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. But it's important to have some of those things, and it's important to understand what those gaps are. So when you do it as economic development staff, but also include some of your stakeholders, some of your leaders around, so that they, again, get an understanding of what really is the current situation with economic development in your community. It's nothing to be embarrassed or negative about it. It's just a realistic look, and people who look realistically are going to succeed because they can now then start to put those strategies in place to overcome some of those weaknesses. And again, I wouldn't call them weaknesses. I would say they're gaps and something that you can develop to close. So I think,
Colleen, it's good when you get like a room full of economic development people, and then a mixture of local leaders and economic developers and the other administration, and you do this. I can remember when we did this in Vancouver, and when I had a whole group of communities together, chiefs and council members and administration, land planners and EDOs, and everybody did it, and everybody had their own different perspective on where they thought they were, but again, even nobody really ranked themselves so high that they passed. I don't remember if we had one that put up their hand saying that they passed. But it's so important, you're right, about including those local leaders, the chief and council, into this, because it helps them see, again, what needs to be done to help support that local economy.
And again, it supports one of our other successes that we say you need to do is communicate what you do. And through this readiness, by including everyone around that table, they can see as economic development and staff what it is you do or what you do need to do.
Yeah. Or in some cases, Colleen, what you don't do.
Yeah. All right.
Understand your local and regional assets. Now we include, and we could have picked pictures across the country, but the principles are still the same. If you're in Saskatoon, if you're, or if you're in, Flin Flon, Manitoba, and with Peter Ballantyne First Nations or whatever, it's the assets are not just what's within your own community, but the assets of everybody else around you and within your nation. And think about, in Saskatoon and the Saskatchewan airport, or the hospital, or the cancer clinics, or parks, recreation facilities, et cetera, et cetera. They are your assets as well as other people's assets. And you need to understand what those are, especially if you want to get into, attracting people to, we've got, nations that have attracted companies to invest in their communities and to do things, but they're not going to build on that community if they don't understand what the regional assets are to service their staff, to support their staff, to support the growth of the business, or even if it's a retailer, the retail, is there enough people there to support that retail investment? So always understand what your local and regional assets are, and not think, well, we don't have this because it's there. You do have that. If it's within a 45-minute to an hour's drive from your community, it's your asset. And it's important to, and in some cases it might be a little bit longer or might be shorter, but you've got to remember that those are your assets.
Yeah, and there's great tools online that you can find to do an asset inventory exercise, and that shouldn't have to take a long time. But again, just look, as Dale says, about that hour distance that you would drive to. What are those assets that belong to you? So not just your hospitals and your airport, but education, the parks and recreation, the shopping facilities, like it's everything, because you're not only addressing the company itself, right, who's looking mainly at perhaps workforce, but you're looking at the workforce. And as workforce, what do we want to do? We want to go do a little shopping. We want to visit the parks and take our kids out. And we might want to see a movie when we can again. But so there's some great tools out there, and it's an exercise that's pretty easy to do, and really lets you look at your community in a different way.
So I understand a lot of people are having problems hearing it, and I'm very sorry about that. I'm not really sure how we fix that. So we have a couple of other videos that we'll skip, but we will send you the links to them, and we will still talk about them. We might watch the first couple of minutes so that we really can talk intelligently about them, of course. But this particular video is about the Stronger Together, the Can-Do program with the Government of Canada. As for Lenny, I'm not 100% positive if this has been renewed, and I'm really hoping it has. It's so important, and we see this throughout we see this everywhere, where they need to you need to have stronger partnerships between the Indigenous government, the local government, the regional government, It's one thing to have a relationship with the federal and the provincial governments, but the local levels, we need to develop these relationships and these partnerships together. And we've been talking to local governments and telling them they need to do this. They need to reach out. They need to engage. They need to include. Need to do whatever they can to do what you can where possible to work together. And and there's some really good examples out there where partnerships have happened. I can even just think in my own community where with the Stolo Nation and the development of the retail and the commercial and areas have all been done in partnership with the city government, and they wouldn't have happened, frankly, if it hadn't have been for the First Nations, the Indigenous community coming to the table with the city to make these projects happen, and they wouldn't have happened without them working together. And so and I think that the Stronger Together program is a really good example of building those relationships, and we've seen it happen in the Vernon, BC area with the Stronger Together program, and other areas, and I'm not sure if Kelowna has done that through the West Bank First Nations and the city and the regional district, but there's several examples across the country, and we've been trying to help the Flin Flon and encouraging the Flin Flon and Creighton and Denair Beach area, which is two provinces but one set of communities, to build stronger relationship with the Peter Ballantine First Nations to make sure that everybody's sort of working together where possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here's a good example of a partnership that's been quite successful out in BC. So it's a housing development that's been built through a partnership with the provincial government of British Columbia and the city of Langford. And city of Langford is, for those who don't know, is located just outside of Victoria on Vancouver Island. And it's with the Macola Housing Society. And what they had done a couple of years ago is they had identified that they were losing a lot of their community members going somewhere else because of housing affordability and availability. And they decided that they wanted to do something about that. So what they did is they approached the government in Langford, and over the last year or two, they have built some homes there. So there's a total of 100 homes that are being built for people to live back in that community in Langford. 60 of those homes have been fully completed now, and actually the move-in date was July 15th of this year. So the remaining 40 homes are going to be completed in 2021. And in addition to the housing, what they've done is they've taken the ground floor of the building, and that includes some office space. So two Indigenous nonprofit organizations will work out of there. The Macola Development Services, as you can see on the screen there, they're an Indigenous development consulting firm. So they'll be in one of the office spaces downstairs or at floor level, street level. And the other one is the Hahitan Family and Community Services Society. And they really focus on programs for Indigenous youth and families. So, this partnership, the province contributed about $8 million, and they're going to provide an annual operating subsidy of roughly about $430,000. The city itself, the city of Langford, they contributed about $400,000, or will be contributing $400,000 in municipal waivers. And the Macola Housing Society, they provided the land that the housing is built on. That's about $1.4 million in value there. Plus they've got some equity in there, about $750,000. So it's a great program that really identified or was created because of an identified need to keep the folks in the community, and that's really important.
Trying to change the slide here. Okay, yeah. Have your foundational pieces in place. So it's really, really important that that you have. It's not just about having a good office and everything else. You need a lot of these other foundational pieces like community profiles, social media, the use of social media, websites, we have, when we talk about social media, it isn't just about Facebook. And we have there's some really good examples of the use of Facebook from a community development perspective. But if you're talking to business and it's those business to business relationships, LinkedIn is the best. So make sure you have a variety of tools that you're using to market and to talk about your community and the opportunities that you offer.
Yeah, and these websites, these foundational pieces, they are really important. And a lot of times the focus, when you look at these foundational pieces, we think they're to an external audience, which they definitely are, but there's also an internal audience that needs this type of information. For example, if you have an entrepreneur who's looking at perhaps some options and opportunities, but they already live in your community, having these foundational pieces in place will really assist them. And these pieces include, as Dale says, whether it's a Facebook page or LinkedIn, but it's a community profile that really talks about the demographics in your community, but in that region. So again, thinking broader base, thinking back to those regional assets that you have, that greater workforce that's part of your community, whether they live in your community or not within your boundaries. These are all really important things to have. And again, I'm just going to go back because I know especially a lot of the people who fund economic development think, well, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. So much of this stuff can be done in a cost-effective way.
Yeah, and you don't need fancy, like it doesn't need to be high cost fancy brochures that need to be printed. It's like a good website that can be done at a reasonable price. And if you're most today anyways, is most of the stuff is actually not even printed. It's put together in a in a good PDF document that's available for download off of websites. So it doesn't need to cost a lot of money. This, in many ways, engaging your business community needs to be your number one priority. It is so important to recognize the assets of your existing businesses and what it is they're providing, whether it's a construction company that is operating within the community, or you see a shop on the left hand side there that is actually like water sport type of equipment, and then you got a gas station, and these are all businesses that are employing people, that are creating revenue for the community, that are whether it's a community owned facility or whether it's an externally owned facility, and whether it's even within your own boundaries. Make sure that you know exactly what your businesses and the businesses need, and the challenges that they may be having, and maybe the opportunities for growth and for new job creation. And like I can remember when we were talking, Colleen talked about at the very beginning about the importance of the disasters and being prepared for disasters. And we when here we are in today's environment of COVID, where all of our businesses are being impacted. It doesn't, some are gaining, some are doing well, some are not like doing well at all and may close. But if we don't even know, if we don't even engage with those types of businesses before a disaster, how do we help them during a disaster? And I think of the community when we were doing some disaster work in Alberta after the flooding, and we were in the Siksika First Nations, and we went in there, or we were in the area, and we were talking to the community, and they were talking about their programs, and they were saying like they had so many home-based businesses that were operating, whether they were construction companies or just somebody selling product or artists, but they had no record really of what those businesses were doing, and even in some cases like how best to communicate with them. And so it's important to have an engagement program where you're talking to all of your businesses to find out what their opportunities are.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think it matters what size your community is. If you only have 3 businesses in your community, you need to be talking to those 3 businesses. If you have 3,000 or, 300,000, like, I don't care what the number is. You've got to be talking to the businesses. Now, it's important to note, like, if you have 3,000 businesses, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to talk to all 3,000 businesses, particularly in any quick fashion, right? So remember, when you do brief, don't think, or when you engage with your business community, don't think that if I can't connect with all of them, maybe I better not do it. So connect with who you can. So if that's only, meeting or talking to 2 or 3 businesses in a month, that's okay. The important thing is that you're doing it. The important thing is that you're starting it. And the important thing is you're starting to collect information from your businesses that are really key to your economic development success. It's key for you to understand what their needs are and what they require, so that you actually can go, okay, you know what, I could maybe put a program around this to help. Or maybe, I can connect these guys with a program that already exists. So it's really important just to start at whatever level that you can, because as Dale said, I totally agree that connecting and engaging with your business community should be your #1 activity in economic development.
So it's that foster that entrepreneurial environment. The previous video was on entrepreneurship and supporting Indigenous entrepreneurship. Colleen, can you talk about some of these businesses that are on here and how important it is, to work? Again, it's a good example of working with your existing businesses and the importance of supporting the growth of your local entrepreneurs.
Yeah, these are all really good examples and have great stories behind them. The previous video was actually from Futurepreneur, and it just talked about their programs that they have, and they've got some really, really good programs that'll help individuals to start a business. And their Indigenous program, that one specifically supports entrepreneurs between the ages of 18 and 39, and it will help to either launch or buy a business. So they'll provide up to about $60,000, I believe, in financing, and an expert mentor that will be with that individual for up to 2 years, which I think is a great add-on, not just money, but some of that additional support of a mentor who's been there, done that can help somebody new into the business. Plus lots of other supports that they have. One thing I do want to mention before I talk about these folks here on Futurepreneur is they have a free business plan writer. So it's online, and the tool is really easy to use, and it really walks you through how to write a business plan. It gives you those templates and those prompts so that you make sure that your business plan has got everything that it needs in it before you start looking at perhaps financing options, whether it's Futurepreneur or not. It doesn't matter. I would say anybody who's interested in starting a business and needs to get to that point where they have to develop a business plan should just go on to that, and we'll again provide that tool afterwards. And it's an excellent tool to help you write your business plan. So these are three examples, and I don't know if all of them went through Futurepreneur, but I think the majority of them did, 2 out of 3 anyways. And the first one there is Nietzsche Gear, and it's a sports clothing line, and it was started, the owner is Kendall Nitmark, and he was a student at the University of Saskatchewan. And what he did is he saw 2 posters up on the wall for 2 different business competitions, and he thought, you know what, I maybe want to start a business, so I'm going to enter. So he entered it, and he ended up winning both of the competitions. He, I think, won about $16,000. So he took that money and funneled it into his business. He operated it out of his dorm room or apartment, whatever it was, until he finished off his education. And then he's been able to take that business obviously full time, and over the last number of years, his product is sold throughout North America. It's quite successful, and a percentage of the profits go to increasing participation in sports by underprivileged youth. And if you've got some time, he's got a beautiful and heartwarming story as to why he does that, and it's just a great inspiration. Kukuli is a cafe. It's located in the Okanagan of BC, and it started as a pop-up shop just outside a car wash. And what she did was she was just selling bannock. But really what her dream was to open a full service, sort of smaller type focused cafe restaurant, which they have, and they've been operating it now. I think they're going into their 10th year of business. But again, just started as a pop-up, didn't know what to do. And what I love about this story is she knew she wanted to start this, but needed education. Didn't have the time to actually go into a program and a schooling. So her and her husband thought, well, you know what? Well, why don't we learn from people who know how to sell coffee, who know how to sell, the pastries and the sandwiches. So one of them, I believe, got a job at Tim Hortons. The other got a job at Starbucks, and just kind of learned how to serve the public. What do people look like, or not look like? What do people want? What are they looking for? That sort of thing. And it's been a great success. She opened up a second location just in a neighboring community, and she then went to Futurepreneur and sold that business to one of the existing employees at that second location. Again, a great story. Lots of really cool lessons that can be learned for either youth wanting to start a business or existing entrepreneurs. It's a great story. And then just super quick, then we'll just touch on Spirit Bear. They are Canada's first Indigenous owned and operated coffee company. And their success really comes by being really progressive on seeking partnerships and ways that they can get their products into as many markets as they can. So they've developed so many partnerships. They've coffee served at Cooley, but so many other restaurants globally. Pacific Coastal Lines, they're sort of the official coffee brand there. The BCPGA, the Golf Association, and they even have their coffee in the Swiss Chamber of Commerce just by sending their coffee to them. One day they said, oh, you know what, let's just send our coffee and see what they think. And, a partnership was made. So some really great stories about how you can start a business and how you can succeed in it. Yeah, I don't hear Dale. Does anybody else? But I can start on using your tourism assets. This is a really important part. So, we said to look at those regional assets, and a lot of those regional assets are going to be tourism assets. And, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that visitors to communities, visitors to regions, even visitors to your province are going to be your future residents and your future workforce. So having those tourism assets and using those to the best of your ability is really an important link with economic development.
Yeah, and Colleen, I had said a whole bunch of brilliant things before I realized that I was muted. But and I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. But it's like Colleen said, is the tourism potential that you have in your communities, and in many of the communities around our country are incredible. And one of the things that I liked about the video that we didn't show you there, but we will send you a link to, is that the community itself was actually asking people that live in the community, what are your experiences? Come and talk about what are your experiences, because in many times we take our tourism assets for granted. We use them and we enjoy them, but we don't think about what opportunity is that for our community, for our region. And so it's really, utilize those tourism aspects for tourism, but even for more than for tourism. Therefore, for selling your community to outsiders, for maybe you're wanting to do some residential developments. How are you getting the people there, and talking about, I'm just looking at some places in the Okanagan of British Columbia, and I'm driving through some of the back areas, and I know that I'm in, the Okanagan Indian Bands, First Nations, or some of the how they've incorporated, some of the residential and golf and other things into their tourism assets is just, and into attracting my investment or other people's investment is really impressive. Celebrate the small things. Everything that you do does not have to be huge. And many times you are doing so many amazing things in your communities And we just take it for granted. We just go, oh, we did it, move on to the next item, but we don't tell people. We don't celebrate that success. And whether it's a little market you're doing, or whether it's you've just created and launched your new plan, or whether you've developed a new web page focusing on local businesses and local entrepreneurs in your community. Those are things to celebrate. Let people know what you're doing. Let people know what you've accomplished. And whether it's you or the community itself needs to highlight these things, because so many times we just think if it's not big, it's not important to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And this actually really starts to build that support for economic development and what it is you do. Because again, going back to the very beginning, if you're not communicating out what you're doing, big, small, or in between, nobody thinks you're doing anything, to be quite honest with you, right? So they just think, these things are happening as if by magic. You have to claim ownership of what it is you're doing as economic development. And as Dale said, it doesn't matter how small they are. It certainly doesn't matter how big they are. You've got to get it out there and celebrate it.
Measure your success, and we'll go back to when we started very early on. We talked about strategic planning and the need for an economic development strategy. Part of your economic development strategy should have built in some performance measurements. How are we knowing what we're achieving? How are we measuring the success of what we had identified that we want to do? Are we doing it? What have we done? What haven't we done? Why haven't we done it? What can we do to change? So you measure it, you plan it, you measure it, you repeat it. And in many cases, things in your strategy will be ongoing programs, and some they'll be start and finish, but we need to measure so that we can, again, it provides that accountability, and then you need to communicate it.
Yeah. And what we're seeing as a trend when we look at measuring your success, just in the last maybe 2 years, it's still pretty new. Typically we measure success by, the number of businesses. Maybe it's the number of building permits, the value of those building permits, that sort of thing, those sort of hard numbers. And what we're really starting just slowly to see is more of those soft numbers, or those soft issues, those social issues that are coming in, that happiness factor, if you will. Those are some of the things now that communities are starting to measure as their rule, right? So it's really important to see how that's going to go in the future. I'm actually I'm pretty chuffed about it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's really come to a head with COVID, Colleen, because I think and other disasters, and we've seen this so many times, is we have a tendency to focus on those things that we really have no control over. We measure things that we really have no control over. We do not necessarily have control over the number of jobs created. And we don't have the control over the number of permits, because what happens is there's external forces, external threats that can jeopardize those efforts. Does that mean it's your fault? Think about COVID. Think of how many people lost their jobs, or maybe development stopped, or something stopped, businesses closed. That wasn't the economic development person's fault. It wasn't chief and council's fault. It was a global pandemic that created this crisis. And so we can't, let's not just take credit for the things that we have no control over, because I don't think we want to take credit for those things when the downturn happens, when the bad side happens, right? And then, of course, as we were just talking about with COVID, and this is a piece that we really feel that communities need to really focus on, and making resiliency and recovery your new norm. We've been talking about being prepared for a disaster now since we first started doing disaster recovery in 2012. And we don't like to really say too much, but about how much work we've done around the disasters, but we've done it in British Columbia, we've done it in the United States, and helped with their recovery program back in 2013 in a new recovery framework. We've done stuff in the Virgin Islands and in Asia. And, you know, honestly, we find that communities should be better prepared for when a disaster strikes. And then we have COVID. And we've been talking about this in so many communities with, could there have been programs developed? Could there have been initiatives that were sort of on the shelf ready to launch in the event of a disaster? And your disasters, not just COVID, your disasters are wildfires, your disasters are flooding and, you know, hurricanes, and as Colleen mentioned, you know, earthquakes or whatever might disrupt your economy is an economic disaster. And so we do actually full day workshops on disasters, and I believe it's next week we're actually doing a 1-hour session on making resiliency and recovery the new norm. So I won't talk a lot more about it because next week we'll be repeating it. So, Colleen, do you want to add any more to that one?
No, we look forward to presenting some stuff next week for you folks. We're pretty excited about that because, you know, as much as I say, it's frustrating that this seems to be getting to be more and more of a focus of our work. The more we can get the word out, the happier we are. Yeah.
And that's and those were the 13 things. And I don't know if anybody was counting, but it really was 13. So if you have any questions, we can take them now. Or again, like I say, there's our email addresses. I believe Can Do will be sending out the presentation. And again, if you want clarification, if you know, what did you mean by that? Or who did you mean? Or who are you referring to? You know, give us an email and we're happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Dale and Colleen. Yes, we will be sending out an email with a link to the presentation and also a link to the videos. That was also posted in the chat, as well as a link to registration for next week's resiliency workshop. That's also going to be put on by Dale and Colleen, as they mentioned. So again, thank you so much, Dale and Colleen.
Can I add a couple of things here? Sorry,
okay, sure.
A couple of the comments that just came in. And I wanted to say, Derek, I think it's Derek Niposh. I agree with you. I mean, and that video really highlighted it. And I don't know how much you had to pay to get that video done, but that video, even though it was directed and targeted really at your local community, it opened my eyes to a part of the country that I had never seen, and how beautiful it was. And we talk about how in British Columbia we're so beautiful. I got to tell you, I'd love to see Mississippi. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous. And Tracy, what I like about your comment is that's business retention. That's business engagement, where you attended a workshop where, you know, the small business owners got together and talk about their mistakes and failures and stuff they needed to know about. And that is business engagement and work. And whether you do it with an individual meeting, as we were talking about, or whether you get businesses together in the same room, you will find that when it's separate, when it's individual, they may open up a little bit more personal basis. But even in focus groups, you can really get to sharing some of what those businesses have experienced, and it helps to educate the others. And so they learn from each other. And we've seen where in focus groups, there have been trends, there's been things identified that would benefit the whole community as a whole, and then they get created. So I think there's a lot of different ways to engage business, but Tracy, I'm so glad you mentioned what you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And just with that, it's too bad we weren't able to play the video, although it was only music, so we could have. But there's so many best practices that I could go on about not only the video, but the program that they developed. I know it's a couple of years old now for sure, but it's a great best practice of what they've done there. Love it.
All right, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Great. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great day. We'll hopefully see you all back next Wednesday. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.